The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ethermore Palace as Captain Marcus Blackstone walked through the grand corridors with heavy steps. In his weathered hands, he carried a sealed envelope that would change everything for the royal family of Valdoria. The weight of the document felt heavier than his sword, heavier than the armor he had worn in countless battles defending the crown. Marcus had served the royal family for 25 years. He had protected King Edmund through 3 assassination attempts, stood guard during the birth of Princess Isabella, and had been the one to carry news of Queen Mother Adelaide's passing. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for what he was about to do today. The kingdom of Valdoria had been ruled by the Thornfield dynasty for over 3 centuries. King Edmund Thornfield III had ascended to the throne at the young age of 28 after his father's sudden death from a hunting accident. That was 15 years ago, and Edmund had proven himself to be a wise and just ruler. His marriage to Lady Catherine Ashworth 7 years ago had been celebrated throughout the kingdom as a union that would strengthen Valdoria's ties with the neighboring kingdom of Westmarch. However, behind the palace walls, all was not as perfect as it appeared to the outside world. Queen Catherine had come from a noble family known for their political ambitions and ruthless pursuit of power. Her father, Duke Gregory Ashworth, controlled vast trade routes and had significant influence in Westmarch's court. The marriage had indeed been beneficial for Valdoria's economy and diplomatic relations, but it had come at a personal cost to King Edmund. Marcus remembered the early days of the royal marriage. King Edmund had been hopeful that love would grow between him and Catherine over time. He had showered her with gifts, given her free rein to redecorate the palace, and had even allowed her to bring several of her family members into important positions within the court. The king genuinely tried to make the arrangement work, believing that a strong royal marriage was essential for the stability of the kingdom. Queen Catherine, however, had never hidden her disappointment with the marriage. She had been in love with Sir Rowland Blackwater, a knight from her father's court, and had been forced to abandon that relationship for the sake of political alliance. She performed her royal duties with cold efficiency but showed little warmth toward her husband. Their public appearances were carefully orchestrated displays of unity, while their private interactions were formal and distant. The breaking point had come 6 months ago during the Harvest Festival. King Edmund had been making his annual speech to the gathered nobles and common folk when he collapsed on the platform. The court physicians later revealed that the king had been slowly poisoned over several weeks. The poison was subtle, designed to weaken rather than kill, but it had been administered consistently enough to cause serious damage to his health. The investigation that followed uncovered a web of conspiracy that reached deep into the palace hierarchy. Several servants had been bribed, letters had been intercepted, and secret meetings had been held in the castle's hidden passages. At the center of it all was Queen Catherine, working with her brother Duke Marcus Ashworth and Sir Rowland Blackwater to weaken the king's position and eventually claim power for herself. The evidence was overwhelming. Encrypted letters in Catherine's personal chambers detailed plans to have Edmund declared unfit to rule due to his poor health. Financial records showed payments to corrupt physicians who would support claims about the king's mental state. Most damning of all was a letter in Catherine's own handwriting discussing the timeline for Edmund's removal and her assumption of power as regent. King Edmund had spent weeks reviewing the evidence, hoping against hope that there might be some explanation that would clear his wife's name. He consulted with his most trusted advisors, including Marcus, Lord Chancellor William Hartwell, and his younger sister Princess Isabella. Each conversation only confirmed what everyone already knew but nobody wanted to say aloud. The king had changed dramatically over those months. The man who once laughed easily and enjoyed long rides through the countryside now spent most of his time alone in his study. His brown hair had developed streaks of gray seemingly overnight, and the lines around his green eyes had deepened with worry and betrayal. He had lost weight, not from the lingering effects of the poison but from the stress of discovering that the person he had tried so hard to love had been systematically trying to destroy him. Princess Isabella had been the one to finally convince her brother to take action. At 22, she possessed wisdom beyond her years and a fierce loyalty to both Edmund and the kingdom. She had been present during many of the investigation meetings and had seen how the betrayal was eating away at her brother's soul. Edmund, she had said during their last private conversation, keeping Catherine here is not just dangerous for you personally. It's dangerous for the entire kingdom. If she succeeds in her plans, Valdoria could become a puppet state controlled by Westmarch. Father would never have allowed this to continue, and neither should you. The legal proceedings had been handled in absolute secrecy. Only 5 people in the entire kingdom knew what was happening: King Edmund, Princess Isabella, Lord Chancellor Hartwell, Captain Marcus, and the court's most trusted legal advisor, Master Thomas Grenville. The documents had been prepared carefully, ensuring that every law had been followed and every procedure had been completed correctly. Under Valdorian law, a monarch could dissolve a marriage on grounds of treason, which Catherine's actions clearly constituted. The evidence had been reviewed by a secret tribunal of 3 senior judges, all of whom had confirmed that the charges were valid and the punishment was appropriate. The dissolution would be immediate and final, with Catherine stripped of all titles and properties within Valdoria. Now, as Marcus approached the Queen's private chambers, he thought about the conversation he had had with King Edmund just an hour earlier. The king had aged visibly in the past months, but there had been something different about him this morning. For the first time in weeks, Edmund had stood straight and spoke with the authority that had made him respected throughout the kingdom. "Marcus," the king had said, "I know this is not the duty you signed up for when you became captain of the guard. But you are the only person I trust completely to handle this matter with the discretion it requires. Catherine must be given the documents, and she must be escorted from the palace immediately. There can be no delay and no opportunity for her to create a scene that might damage the kingdom's reputation." Marcus had accepted the assignment without question, as he had done countless times before. But he knew that this moment would mark a turning point not just for the royal family, but for the entire kingdom. The people of Valdoria loved their king and had accepted Queen Catherine as part of their royal family. The truth about her betrayal would have to be revealed carefully to avoid causing panic or rebellion. As he reached the ornate doors leading to Catherine's chambers, Marcus paused for a moment to compose himself. Through the windows, he could see the gardens where the Queen often spent her mornings, and, beyond that, the city of Valdoria stretching toward the horizon. Thousands of people were going about their daily lives, completely unaware that their world was about to change forever. The 2 guards stationed outside Catherine's chambers saluted as Marcus approached. He had handpicked these men years ago for their loyalty and discretion. They would ensure that whatever happened in the next few minutes remained private until the king was ready to make an official announcement. Marcus knocked 3 times on the heavy wooden door, the sound echoing through the corridor. From inside, he heard Catherine's voice, as cold and imperious as always, commanding him to enter. He took a deep breath, gripped the envelope more tightly, and pushed open the door that would seal the Queen's fate. The room was exactly what one would expect of a queen's chambers. Rich tapestries covered the walls, depicting scenes from Valdoria's history and Catherine's family crest. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating expensive furniture imported from across the kingdom. Fresh flowers in crystal vases filled the air with a sweet fragrance that somehow made the moment feel even more surreal. Queen Catherine stood near her writing desk, dressed in a deep blue gown that emphasized her status and authority. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate style that had become fashionable among noble ladies throughout the kingdom. At 26, she was undeniably beautiful, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything and trust nothing. Those same eyes that had once been praised by poets and courtiers now looked at Marcus with barely concealed irritation. "Captain Blackstone," she said, not bothering to look up from the letter she was writing, "I was not expecting any appointments this morning. If this is about security arrangements for tonight's dinner, surely it could have waited until this afternoon." Marcus remained standing at attention near the doorway, the envelope held firmly in both hands. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind dozens of times, but now that it was actually happening, he found it difficult to speak. This woman had lived in the palace for 7 years. He had protected her during public appearances, had ensured her safety during travels, and had always treated her with the respect due to a queen. The fact that she had been plotting against her own husband while accepting that protection made his duty today both easier and more difficult. "Your Majesty," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation, "I come here today not on routine palace business, but as an official representative of His Majesty King Edmund. I carry documents that require your immediate attention and response." Something in his tone must have alerted Catherine to the seriousness of the moment. She set down her quill and turned to face him fully, her expression shifting from irritation to wariness. For the first time since he had entered the room, she seemed to really see him, taking note of his formal posture and the official nature of his visit. "What documents?" she asked, moving closer to where he stood. "If Edmund has some new protocol he wishes me to follow, he could have discussed it with me directly. We may not share the warmth of a love match, but we have always maintained proper communication about matters affecting the kingdom." The irony of her words was not lost on Marcus. Proper communication would have involved discussing her dissatisfaction with the marriage rather than plotting to poison and overthrow her husband. But he kept his expression neutral as he extended the envelope toward her. "These documents concern your status as Queen of Valdoria, Your Majesty. King Edmund has asked me to ensure that you understand their contents completely and that you acknowledge receipt of them in the presence of witnesses." Catherine's face went pale as she accepted the envelope. Her hands, which had always been steady during public ceremonies and court functions, trembled slightly as she broke the royal seal. Marcus watched her carefully, ready to react if she attempted to destroy the documents or flee the room. But Catherine was too intelligent to waste energy on futile gestures. Instead, she began reading with the focused attention of someone who understood that her entire future was contained within those pages. The silence in Queen Catherine's chambers stretched on as she read through the dissolution documents. Marcus watched her face transform from confusion to shock to anger as the full implications of what she was reading became clear. The legal language was formal and precise, but the message was unmistakable: her marriage to King Edmund was being terminated immediately on grounds of high treason against the crown. Catherine's breathing became shallow as she reached the section detailing the evidence against her. The documents listed every intercepted letter, every bribed servant, every secret meeting that had been uncovered during the investigation. Her own handwriting was quoted extensively, including passages from letters she had written to her brother discussing the timeline for Edmund's removal from power. "This is impossible," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "These accusations are completely false. I have served this kingdom faithfully for 7 years. I have fulfilled every duty required of a queen." Marcus remained silent, allowing her to process the information at her own pace. He had been present during many of the investigation meetings and had seen the evidence firsthand. There was no question about Catherine's guilt, but he understood that she needed time to realize that her carefully constructed plans had been discovered and documented. Catherine moved to the large window overlooking the palace gardens, still clutching the documents in her hands. For a moment, she stood there looking out at the world that had been her domain for 7 years. The gardens had been redesigned according to her preferences, with flowers and paths arranged to create the perfect view from her chambers. The irony was bitter: she was looking at one of the few positive changes she had made to the palace while holding proof of her betrayal in her hands. "How long has Edmund known?" she asked without turning around. Her voice was calmer now, the voice of someone beginning to accept an unavoidable reality. "His Majesty began to suspect something was wrong 6 months ago when he became ill," Marcus replied. "The formal investigation began 4 months ago after the court physicians confirmed that he had been poisoned. The evidence has been carefully gathered and verified since that time." Catherine laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. 4 months. He has known for 4 months and said nothing. We have attended state dinners together, hosted visiting dignitaries, performed all the ceremonies required of a royal couple. And, through it all, he was building a case against me. She turned back to face Marcus, and he was struck by how much she had changed in just a few minutes. The imperious queen who had been writing letters at her desk was gone, replaced by a woman who suddenly looked much younger and more vulnerable. The mask of royal authority had slipped, revealing someone who was perhaps not as calculating and cold as she had always appeared. "What happens now?" Catherine asked. "The documents mention immediate dissolution and removal from the palace. Am I to be arrested? Executed? Exiled?" Marcus had anticipated these questions and had been instructed by the king on how to respond. "Your Majesty, under Valdorian law, the penalty for treason is death. However, His Majesty has chosen to show mercy in consideration of your royal status and the potential impact on diplomatic relations with Westmarch. You will be stripped of all titles and properties within Valdoria, but you will be allowed to leave the kingdom safely." The relief on Catherine's face was evident, though it was quickly replaced by a new kind of worry.
Westmarch. My father. Does he know about any of this?
Duke Gregory has not been informed of the investigation or its results, Marcus replied. King Edmund wishes to handle this matter as quietly as possible to avoid creating a diplomatic crisis. However, any future communication between you and your family will be monitored, and you will not be permitted to return to Valdoria under any circumstances. Catherine set the documents down on her writing desk and moved to the large wardrobe that dominated one wall of her chambers. She began pulling out dresses and personal items, her movements quick and efficient. It was clear that she understood the urgency of the situation and was not going to waste time on futile protests or emotional displays. "How much time do I have to prepare?" she asked as she folded a traveling dress into a leather trunk. "1 hour," Marcus replied. "A carriage has been prepared to take you to the border with Westmarch. You may bring personal belongings that can fit in 2 trunks, but all jewelry and items of significant value that were gifts from the crown must remain in the palace." As Catherine continued packing, Marcus found himself reflecting on the complexity of the situation. On one hand, Catherine had clearly committed treason against her husband and the kingdom. The evidence was overwhelming, and the penalty prescribed by law was death. On the other hand, she was a young woman who had been forced into a political marriage and had found herself trapped in a loveless relationship with no clear path to happiness. The Kingdom of Valdoria had benefited significantly from the trade agreements and diplomatic ties that had come with Catherine's marriage to Edmund. The ports were busier than they had been in decades, and the increased commerce had brought prosperity to many of the kingdom's citizens. Catherine herself had been an effective queen in many ways, organizing charitable activities and representing Valdoria with dignity during state visits. But none of those positive contributions could excuse the attempt to poison and overthrow the king. Edmund had tried genuinely to make the marriage work, and Catherine had responded by plotting his destruction. The betrayal was personal, but its implications went far beyond the royal family.
"Captain Blackstone," Catherine said as she continued packing, "may I ask you a personal question?"
Marcus nodded, though he remained alert for any sign that she might be planning something unexpected.
"Do you think Edmund will be happier without me?" she asked.
"I know that our marriage was not what either of us wanted, but I had hoped that we might at least find some form of friendship or mutual respect." The question surprised Marcus with its apparent sincerity. For a moment, he saw not the plotting queen who had tried to poison her husband, but a young woman who seemed genuinely curious about whether her removal from the palace might be better for everyone involved. "His Majesty has been deeply troubled by recent events," Marcus replied carefully. "I believe that once this matter is resolved, he will be able to focus on the business of ruling the kingdom without the additional burden of worrying about threats from within his own household."
Catherine nodded as if she had expected that answer.
She moved to her jewelry box and began sorting through its contents, setting aside the pieces that had been gifts from Edmund and keeping only items that had belonged to her family. Her movements were methodical, and Marcus realized that she was approaching this situation with the same calculated efficiency that she had brought to her royal duties.
"There is something I want you to understand, Captain," Catherine said as she worked.
"I never intended for Edmund to be seriously harmed. The poison was meant to weaken him gradually, to make him appear unfit to rule. The plan was to have him step down voluntarily and retire to a life of leisure while I served as regent. I thought it would be better for everyone if the transition of power appeared to be his own choice." Marcus listened to this explanation without comment, though internally he found it difficult to accept. Poisoning someone, even with non-lethal doses, was an act of violence that could easily have resulted in permanent damage or death. The fact that Catherine had convinced herself that she was acting for Edmund's benefit only demonstrated the depth of her self-deception. "I loved someone else," Catherine continued, her voice becoming softer. "Roland and I had planned to marry before my father decided that an alliance with Valdoria would be more beneficial for our family. I thought that if I could become the true ruler of Valdoria, I might be able to bring Roland here and we could finally be together." This was information that had not been included in the investigation reports, and Marcus found it both enlightening and disturbing. Catherine's actions had been motivated not just by political ambition but by a desire to reunite with her lost love. It explained the bitterness and resentment that she had shown toward Edmund throughout their marriage, but it also made her betrayal seem even more personal and cruel. "Your Majesty," Marcus said gently, "I understand that you have faced difficult choices and painful circumstances. However, the methods you chose to address those circumstances put the entire kingdom at risk. King Edmund is a good man who tried to be a good husband to you. He deserved better than poison and betrayal." Catherine stopped packing and looked directly at Marcus for the first time since she had begun reading the dissolution documents. Her blue eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "You are right, of course," she said. "Edmund did not deserve what I did to him. I told myself that I was acting for the greater good, that Valdoria would be stronger under my leadership. But the truth is that I was acting out of selfishness and resentment. I wanted to punish him for not being the man I wished I could have married." The admission surprised Marcus with its honesty. Throughout the investigation, he had come to see Catherine as a calculating and heartless conspirator. This moment of genuine remorse complicated that picture and reminded him that even people who commit terrible acts are still human beings capable of recognizing their mistakes. "What will you do now?" Marcus asked. "Where will you go?" Catherine closed the trunk she had been packing and moved to her writing desk. She picked up the quill she had been using when Marcus first arrived and began writing what appeared to be a letter. "I will return to my father's house initially," she said as she wrote. "But I cannot stay there permanently. My actions have made me a liability for my family's political ambitions. I will probably travel to one of the eastern kingdoms where no one knows who I am. Perhaps I can start over with a new identity." She finished the letter and sealed it with wax, though she did not use her royal seal. Instead, she pressed her signet ring into the soft wax, leaving the mark of her family rather than her royal status. "This is for Edmund," she said, holding out the letter to Marcus. "It is an apology and an explanation. I know it cannot undo what I have done, but I wanted him to understand that I recognize the depth of my betrayal and the pain I have caused." Marcus accepted the letter, though he made no promises about when or whether King Edmund would read it. The king had been clear that he wanted this matter resolved quickly and quietly, with minimal drama or emotional complications. A soft knock at the door interrupted the conversation. One of the guards Marcus had stationed outside entered the room and saluted. "Captain, the carriage is ready, and the driver is waiting in the courtyard. Shall I help Her Majesty with her luggage?" Marcus looked at Catherine, who nodded and pointed to the 2 trunks she had packed. The reality of her departure was becoming immediate and unavoidable. In a few minutes, she would leave the palace that had been her home for 7 years and would never be allowed to return. As the guard lifted the first trunk, Catherine took one final look around her chambers. She moved slowly through the room, touching various objects as if to memorize them. The tapestries, the furniture, the crystal vases filled with fresh flowers, all of it would remain here while she began a new life in exile. "Captain Blackstone," she said as she prepared to leave, "will you tell Edmund that I hope he finds the happiness that I was never able to give him? He deserves a wife who can love him truly, not someone who sees him only as an obstacle to her own desires." Marcus promised to convey the message, though he suspected that King Edmund would need time to heal from this betrayal before he could even consider the possibility of finding love again. The dissolution of the marriage was just the first step in what would likely be a long process of rebuilding trust and moving forward. The journey from Queen Catherine's chambers to the palace courtyard felt like the longest walk of Marcus's career. He followed behind Catherine and the guards carrying her trunks, watching as servants and minor courtiers stopped their activities to stare at the unusual procession. Most of them had no idea what was happening, but they could sense that something significant was taking place. Catherine walked with dignity despite the circumstances, her head held high and her expression composed. She had changed into a traveling dress of deep green that was practical but still elegant enough to reflect her noble birth. Over her arm, she carried a dark cloak that would help conceal her identity once she left the palace grounds. As they descended the grand staircase leading to the main entrance, Marcus caught sight of Princess Isabella standing in the shadows of a doorway. The princess had been waiting to witness Catherine's departure, though she remained far enough away to avoid drawing attention. Her presence was a reminder that this moment affected the entire royal family, not just King Edmund and his soon-to-be former wife. Princess Isabella had been one of Catherine's harshest critics throughout the investigation. She had never trusted her sister-in-law and had frequently warned Edmund that Catherine's behavior suggested hidden motives. The princess possessed an intuitive understanding of people that had served her well in navigating court politics, and she had sensed from the beginning that Catherine's loyalty to Valdoria was questionable. The main courtyard of the palace was a magnificent space surrounded by towering walls and decorated with statues of previous Valdorian kings. Under normal circumstances, it would be bustling with activity as servants, guards, and courtiers went about their daily duties. Today, however, the area had been cleared except for the essential personnel involved in Catherine's departure. The carriage waiting in the center of the courtyard was elegant but unremarkable, designed to transport a noble passenger without drawing excessive attention. The driver was one of Marcus's most trusted men, a veteran guard who had been briefed on the sensitivity of his assignment. He would escort Catherine safely to the border with Westmarch and ensure that she crossed into her home kingdom without incident. As Catherine approached the carriage, she paused and turned back to look at the palace one final time. The massive structure had been her home for 7 years, and, despite the unhappiness of her marriage, it represented a period of her life that had shaped who she had become. The morning sunlight illuminated the stone walls and tall windows, making the palace look particularly beautiful and imposing.
"Your Majesty," Marcus said gently, "it is time to depart."
Catherine nodded and allowed one of the guards to help her into the carriage. As she settled into her seat, Marcus approached the window to deliver his final instructions. "The journey to the border will take approximately 6 hours," he explained. "Driver Chen has been instructed to stop only when necessary and to avoid populated areas where you might be recognized. Once you reach Westmarch territory, you will be free to make your own arrangements for continued travel."
"Thank you, Captain," Catherine replied. "I know this duty has been unpleasant for you, and I appreciate the respect you have shown me despite the circumstances."
Marcus stepped back from the carriage and signaled to driver Chen, who clicked his tongue to encourage the horses into motion. As the vehicle rolled across the cobblestones toward the palace gates, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The immediate crisis was over, but the long-term consequences for the kingdom were only beginning to unfold. Inside the palace, King Edmund stood at the window of his private study, watching the carriage disappear through the gates. He had not wanted to witness Catherine's departure directly, but he felt compelled to see the moment when his marriage officially ended. The past 4 months had been the most difficult of his reign, filled with sleepless nights and agonizing decisions about how to handle the betrayal. Princess Isabella entered the study without knocking, a privilege that only she enjoyed. She moved to stand beside her brother at the window, and together they watched until the carriage was completely out of sight.
"How do you feel?" Isabella asked softly. Edmund was quiet for a long moment before answering.
"Empty," he said finally.
"I thought I would feel angry or relieved or vindicated.
Instead, I just feel empty, as if something important has been taken away even though I know it was the right thing to do."
Isabella understood her brother's conflicted emotions.
Despite Catherine's betrayal, she had been part of their family for 7 years. Her absence would leave a void that went beyond the practical considerations of running the kingdom without a queen. There would be empty chairs at state dinners, unattended royal functions, and a constant reminder that the king's marriage had failed in the most spectacular way possible.
"The people will need an explanation," Isabella said, addressing one of the many challenges that lay ahead. "Catherine has been visible in the kingdom for years. Her sudden disappearance will generate questions and rumors. Edmund had been considering this problem for weeks."
The official story would need to balance honesty with the need to maintain stability and diplomatic relations. Too much detail about Catherine's treason could damage Valdoria's relationship with Westmarch, while too little information could lead to speculation and conspiracy theories. "Lord Chancellor Hartwell is preparing an official announcement," Edmund replied. "We will say that the Queen has requested a dissolution of the marriage due to irreconcilable differences and has chosen to return to her family in Westmarch. It is close enough to the truth to be believable without revealing the full extent of her betrayal."
The announcement would be made that evening during a special session of the Royal Council.
Representatives from each of Valdoria's major cities and regions would be present to hear the news directly from the king, ensuring that accurate information spread quickly throughout the kingdom. By the following morning, every citizen of Valdoria would know that their king was no longer married.
"What about our allies?" Isabella asked. "The trade agreements and diplomatic treaties that were tied to your marriage to Catherine?" This was perhaps the most complex challenge facing the kingdom.
Catherine's marriage to Edmund had been the foundation for numerous economic and political arrangements with Westmarch and other neighboring kingdoms. Her departure as queen would necessarily require renegotiation of many of these agreements, and there was no guarantee that the terms would remain favorable to Valdoria.
"I have already sent discreet messages to our ambassadors in the major kingdoms," Edmund said.
"They have been instructed to begin preliminary discussions about maintaining our current agreements despite the change in my marital status. Duke Gregory may be angry about his daughter's treatment, but he is also a practical man who understands the economic benefits of good relations with Valdoria." The king moved away from the window and sat down at his desk, which was covered with documents requiring his attention. The business of running the kingdom could not stop simply because of personal upheavals, and Edmund was determined to show that Valdoria remained stable and strong despite the changes in the royal family. "There is something else we need to discuss," Isabella said, though her tone suggested reluctance to broach the subject.
"The question of succession. You are 32 years old and now unmarried with no children.
The kingdom will expect you to remarry and produce an heir." Edmund looked up from his papers with an expression of weariness that made him appear older than his years. The question of remarriage was inevitable, but it felt premature to even consider it so soon after dissolving his first marriage. The idea of entering into another political arrangement disguised as a personal relationship was deeply unappealing.
"I understand the necessity," Edmund said.
"But I need time to heal from this betrayal before I can even think about trusting another person with my heart and my kingdom. Perhaps in a year or two, when the immediate crisis has passed and the kingdom has stabilized."
Isabella nodded, understanding her brother's need for time to recover.
However, she also knew that the political pressures would only increase as time passed. Noble families throughout Valdoria and neighboring kingdoms would soon begin positioning their daughters as potential brides for the newly available king. The palace would be flooded with invitations to social events and requests for audiences, all designed to give eligible young women opportunities to meet Edmund. A knock at the study door interrupted their conversation. Lord Chancellor William Hartwell entered after being granted permission, his arms full of documents and his expression serious. At 62, Hartwell was one of the most experienced and trusted advisors in the kingdom, and his counsel had been invaluable throughout the crisis with Catherine. "Your Majesty," Hartwell said as he approached the desk, "I bring news from our border guards. Queen Catherine has successfully crossed into Westmarch territory without incident. Our responsibility for her safety has now ended." The confirmation of Catherine's departure brought a sense of finality to the day's events. She was now officially out of Valdoria and would never return. The kingdom could begin the process of moving forward without the constant worry that she might attempt to regain her position or seek revenge for her exile. "Thank you, Lord Chancellor," Edmund replied. "Please begin preparations for this evening's announcement to the council. I want every detail reviewed and approved before we share this news with our nobles." Hartwell set several documents on the king's desk, including the prepared text of the official announcement and a list of questions that council members were likely to ask. The king's response to these questions would be crucial in maintaining confidence in his leadership and preventing the kind of speculation that could damage the kingdom's reputation. "There is one additional matter, Your Majesty," Hartwell said. "We have received a message from Duke Gregory in Westmarch. He requests permission to send an envoy to discuss the future of our trade relationships in light of recent developments." Edmund was not surprised by this communication. Duke Gregory was Catherine's father, but he was also a shrewd political operator who would prioritize his kingdom's economic interests over personal feelings about his daughter's treatment. The fact that he was reaching out so quickly suggested that he wanted to minimize any disruption to the profitable relationship between Valdoria and Westmarch. "Grant permission for the envoy," Edmund decided. But, make it clear that any discussions must be based on mutual benefit rather than threats or emotional manipulation. Catherine's actions were her own choice, and they do not reflect any hostility on our part toward Westmarch or the Ashworth family. As the day progressed, news of Catherine's departure began to spread throughout the palace despite efforts to keep the information confidential. Servants whispered in corridors, guards exchanged meaningful glances, and courtiers gathered in small groups to discuss what they had observed. The careful secrecy that had surrounded the investigation was no longer possible to maintain. Marcus spent the afternoon meeting with his security staff to discuss the changes that Catherine's absence would require. Guard rotations needed to be adjusted, access protocols had to be modified, and new procedures needed to be established for protecting a bachelor king rather than a married royal couple. These practical considerations helped keep his mind occupied and prevented him from dwelling on the emotional complexity of the morning's events. As evening approached, the palace prepared for King Edmund's announcement to the royal council. The great hall was arranged with chairs for the assembled nobles, and special provisions were made for recording the king's words so that accurate copies could be sent to every region of the kingdom. This would be one of the most important speeches of Edmund's reign, and everyone involved understood the significance of getting every detail right. In his private chambers, King Edmund prepared for the evening's ceremony with the help of his personal attendants. He selected clothing that would convey authority and stability while avoiding anything that might be seen as celebratory. The message he wanted to send was clear: the dissolution of his marriage was a necessary but regrettable action taken for the good of the kingdom. Princess Isabella joined her brother as he made final preparations for the evening's announcement. She had spent the day consulting with various advisors and courtiers, gathering information about the mood in the palace and the likely reaction to the news about Catherine. "The nobles are nervous," she reported. "They know something significant has happened, but the speculation is becoming more dramatic by the hour. Some people think Catherine has died, others believe she has been arrested for treason, and a few are even suggesting that she has fled with a lover." Edmund smiled grimly at the irony of the last rumor. In a sense, Catherine had been motivated by her desire to be with her lover, though the reality was much more complex and dangerous than a simple romantic scandal. "The truth will serve us better than any of these rumors," he said. "Once the nobles understand what actually happened, they will appreciate that we handled the situation with discretion and dignity rather than creating a public spectacle." As the sun set over the kingdom of Valdoria, King Edmund prepared to address his people about the end of his marriage and the beginning.